Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tonellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Hachette Australia. The last time I spoke with Natasha Lester for the podcast was back in 2019. I still can't believe that. And at the time, her astounding novel, The French Photographer, had just been published, a book that was inspired by the life of World War II photojournalist Lee Miller. Now, fast forward 6 years and another 5 novels, Natasha's name has become synonymous with sweeping historical tales which spotlight women's histories and their incredible stories of bravery and strength. And if you haven't yet heard about Natasha's work, well, let me enlighten you. Natasha is an international best-selling author whose novels have been translated into 21 languages. Novels which include A Kiss from Mr. Fitzgerald, Her Mother's Secret, The Paris Seamstress, The French Photographer, The Paris Secret, The Riviera House, The 3 Lives of Alix and Pierre, and The Disappearance of Astrid Bricard. Now, Natasha's latest book is inspired by yet another incredible, brave woman whose story was not widely known. In fact, I had never heard of her before. A woman who was not only a mother, a rally car driver, and journalist, but a spy who rose to the top of the Gestapo's most wanted list for her work in the resistance movement during World War II. Called the Mademoiselle Alliance, this is a most remarkable, moving, inspiring story about a woman whose work to help free France from Nazi occupation went largely unrecognised until recently. And I'm thrilled to welcome Natasha back to the podcast today to talk to me about the woman who inspired this utterly brilliant novel. Hi, Natasha.
Hi, Claudine. How are you? It's great to be back.
Thank you so much. I'm really well and I'm delighted to be talking to you. And I want to say congratulations on this incredible novel.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot to me. I know how many books you read, so it's lovely that you enjoyed it.
I couldn't get enough. Now, when I saw you in Sydney in March when this book was released and I heard you talk about this book, I sensed that this was a book that affected you deeply, not just in the writing of the story, but also due to the sources and the accounts of Marie-Madeleine Foucault's work that you uncovered during your research. So I wanted to ask you, did you feel more emotionally attached to this book because of Marie-Madeleine's extraordinary work?
I did. I think this is the book that has made me cry the most in the writing of it. And I suppose part of that is because Marie-Madeleine led a network in World War II that numbered 3,000 agents at its peak, and 439 of those agents died during the war. They were captured by the Nazis and imprisoned and then eventually tortured and killed. And the thing that struck me as I was writing the book was that most people don't know any of the names of those 439 people who lost their lives fighting for the freedoms that we all enjoy today. And I thought, gosh, is that how meaningless a life can be? I really felt that much more deeply than I did. But of course, it wasn't meaningless because in the end, Hitler was thrown out, he killed himself, the war ended, and it was because of all these small actions that these people were taking. But doesn't that mean that surely more people should know about them? And I guess the sort of unheralded, unselfish bravery of so many people. I mean, this is just in one network, 439 people. There were so many more. That really got to me when I was writing this book.
I felt that at the time when you were talking about it, and I certainly felt this in the reading of the book. Marie-Madeleine was an exceptional woman on so many levels, but what brought her to your attention in the first place? How did she become a figure that you wanted to write about?
It was really accidental. I mean, I've read a lot of nonfiction books about the Second World War because my other novels have been set around that time period. And in all of those books that I'd read, maybe I'd come across her name, I'm going to say probably only once, maybe it was twice. She was almost completely absent, whereas other male resistance heroes like Jean Moulin, who was a extraordinary human being as well, he was in all of the nonfiction books about the war. And the fact that I came across her once and this sentence kind of referred to this leadership role, and I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. I didn't know there was a woman involved in some kind of leadership role. I've never heard of this woman. Why is she not in the history books? And so I went and ordered her memoir, which I discovered that she had written. It was published back in the 1960s, out of print now, obviously. And it arrived from the secondhand bookshop in the US looking tattered and beaten. It was this ex-library copy. It looked really unpromising. And I was thinking to myself, wow, the story in these pages is going to be a lot better than the cover is promising me. But I started to read and like was instantly astonished that I hadn't heard of her and that nobody had really written a novel about her because her life through the war was almost perfectly suited to the beats of a novel. Like it sounds terrible to say that in relation to someone's struggles during the war, but it kind of was. And also just that she was a car valet driver, she was a pilot, she was a mother of two kids the whole time she was leading the Alliance network. She was juggling looking after her children, looking after her agents, fighting for her country. This intense struggle that I hadn't really ever read about before, because when you're reading about male resistance leaders, they don't really spare a thought for their children and they're not weighing up those decisions in the way that she was. And I thought, this is a story that I haven't read before and I want to tell. And also, oh my God, what have you got to do to be a woman to be recognized by history if what she did was not enough? So it made me determined to write the book.
Absolutely fantastic and wonderful. And I'm so glad that you did write it. Unlike the French photographer, which inspired a character in Lee Miller's image, you've written about Marie Madeleine, the actual leader of the resistance movement called the Alliance. Now, what was the difference here? Why did you want to write about Marie Madeleine and specifically from the first person point of view?
I guess when I was writing Jess in The French Photographer, who was inspired by Lee Miller, I knew that Lee had had some quite traumatic experience as a young girl. She was sexually abused, and I wasn't sure that I was the right person to write that story. And so I thought, well, that was obviously a really terrible and probably quite influential thing that had happened to her. And to leave it out of the story felt like I would have been doing her a disservice. So I thought that, well, maybe what I'll do then is take some of the other elements about Lee's life that I'd like to write about and then create a character inspired by those things, because I feel like perhaps I was better equipped to write that story. I didn't want to kind of minimize or, I didn't want to write that story incorrectly because I felt the burden of doing that wouldn't have been right to do that and to do that poorly. So I didn't do it. I sort of didn't cover that part of the character's life because I was writing this inspired by a character. Whereas in Marie Madeleine's life, I wanted to write about every single element of her life because everything she did was something I felt that I had the capacity to write about. And maybe that's simply because I've written more books. And so I've learnt some more things and am better able to do the deep dive into those big emotional scenes. I don't know whether that's part of what it was, but I certainly knew that if I wrote a book with a character inspired by Marie Madeleine, people would wonder and think, oh, some of the more heroic things she did, like smuggling herself across the border into Spain in a mailbag, were things that I had made up. And they are not things that I had made up. They are actually true. She did those things. So I didn't want there to be any doubt about how heroic some of her actions were. I wanted people to know that they were 100% true.
Yeah, indeed. And it is such a powerful story. And she truly was a remarkable figure. So, on that point, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the story.
Yeah, so basically, the book is about this woman who wanted to be a concert pianist. That was her dream from the time that she was a child. And she grew up in Shanghai. She lived for a long time in Morocco. She had this very extraordinary upbringing. In the 1930s, she became this rally car driver, a pilot, a journalist, a mother of two children, the kind of woman who makes us all feel like we need to go out and get a few more hobbies. And then, instead of becoming a concert pianist, the war happens. And so she becomes the only woman to lead a resistance network in World War II France. And not only that, it was the largest resistance network in World War II France that she led. And she stepped into the leadership role at the age of 31 and was leading senior military men decades older than she was, despite the fact that she'd never had any formal military training, no formal training in espionage. She was just an ordinary woman like you or I. You or I could have done what Marie Madeline had done if we'd been forged of the same stuff. So I wanted to convey the enormity of her as a person and also of what she did, but also the fact that she was just like you or I. I think that's really important. And actually, hopefully, for a lot of readers, quite inspiring to read about this woman who knew that to just kind of sit and hope for a better future was a passive thing. You know, we're often told to hope for something better to happen. But if she'd just done that, then nothing would have changed. You know, she said, no, I'm going to take action and do whatever I can to make that better future that I want to happen. And that's what she did. And like, I love that because it makes me remember that in my life, I have more power than I think I do have. It's so easy to feel disempowered, I think, these days. And she never once, well, she never once felt disempowered. She did doubt herself from time to time, but she still did everything she could, regardless of feeling scared.
Indeed. And I want to talk about that doubt a little later. But I first wanted to ask you, how is it, Natasha, that history did not record the work of this outstanding and fearless woman?
Yeah, it's quite remarkable, isn't it? And I think it's because there's two reasons really, and they all relate back to Charles de Gaulle, who obviously was the leader of France after the war. He didn't get along particularly well with the man who initially set up Alliance, the network that Marie Madeline took over the leadership of. And you'd like to think that people would rise above petty grudges in wartime, but actually, the more I read about wartime and people's actions, the more I realize that wars are fueled by petty grudges. And so, because he didn't get along with this man Navarre who'd set the network up, there were a couple of other things that happened, and I won't kind of reveal any spoilers here, that involved sort of Charles de Gaulle and the Alliance network. And the outcome of that was basically that at the end of the war, when Charles de Gaulle created the Compagnon de la Libération, which was an honor he bestowed upon the people he believed had fought the hardest and the most valiantly for France's freedom during the war, he bestowed that honor upon 1,038 people. 1,032 of them were men, so only 6 women, he believed, had fought valiantly for France's freedom during the war, which in and of itself is wrong. And none of those 6 women were Marie Madeline Fourcade, the woman who led the largest resistance network in France. But 3 of her male subordinates received that honor. So 3 men who were reporting to her, who were doing what they were doing because she was directing them, she was giving them the intelligence priorities. And so I think that historians coming after that looked at that list of people and thought, well, if Charles de Gaulle didn't see fit to honor her in that way, then she must not have been important. And therefore, when we're writing about the Second World War, we don't need to include her in our history books. And that's how a woman gets wiped out of the pages of history.
It is absolutely astonishing that that could ever have happened. And I'm so glad to see that there's books like yours that are coming out, and, you know, that she's recently been recognised for her efforts in the war in France. Now, her early life with her husband, Edouard, in Morocco became a kind of training ground, if you will, for her eventual role as the Alliance leader. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, she'd kind of grown up in Shanghai because her father was posted there, and she had this very adventurous kind of life there. Her father died, the family moved back to Paris, and when she was about 17, I kind of feel like she found Paris a little dull after having grown up somewhere like Shanghai. And so she fell in love with this man very quickly, very impulsively. He was a military officer. He was quite a lot older than she was. And at age 18, after knowing this man for only a few weeks, she moved with him to Morocco because that was where he was posted. And I do feel a little bit like, and one of her biographers kind of raises this, that perhaps Morocco was also an attraction as well as Edouard, the man that she married. Because for Marie Madeleine, Morocco was this next kind of exotic place to her, a bit like what Shanghai had been for her as a child. So she arrives in Morocco, and one of the first things she does is to start learning Arabic, which for a woman in the 1920s, a white woman in the 1920s, as an outsider coming into Morocco, is quite extraordinary. And it was kind of lucky that she did, because her husband was a military intelligence officer. Morocco is a French colony at this time. Part of Morocco, sorry, is a French colony at this time. And his job is basically there to spy on the locals, to report back to the French government if there's any unrest or potential uprising, so the French can quash that before it explodes into another war. He has to speak to the locals who speak Arabic, right? And he does not speak the language. Luckily, his beautiful wife, Marie Madeleine, does speak the language. And so she starts accompanying him to meet the tribal leaders who he's supposed to, forge a relationship with so he can gather intelligence from them. And so that's where she gets a little bit of training in intelligence work, this kind of understanding of the fact that information is a commodity and it's valuable, and it's something that when you have it puts you in a position of power. And when people are trying to get that information out of you, you have the power to decide how much you convey. And so she really gets this deep understanding of that, which she then takes back with her to Paris when she and her husband separate in the early 1930s.
So throughout the story, we get glimpses into Marie Madeleine's vulnerabilities. And you mentioned it a little bit before. She's a mother, and we see her often question why she continues to accept her role as the leader of Alliance when she risks never being able to see her children again. And yet she persists. And the reasons she does, I think, are entirely plausible, but also so incredibly selfless. But she doesn't seem to see it that way. So I guess I wondered how much insight into her mindset and actions you got from her memoir, and how much did you kind of intuit?
So she doesn't talk about her children a lot in her memoir, which wasn't at all surprising to me. The fact that she'd even written a memoir was surprising, because a lot of women who were involved in the war didn't do that post-war, because there was this widely held belief after the war that only men were involved in the resistance, not women. So publishers weren't interested in those stories. So she wrote this memoir, and I think for her, perhaps one of two things. She doesn't mention her children a lot because she doesn't want to have people, perceive her as a woman. She wants to write this memoir about what she did, and she could kind of be anyone or a man. When she mentions her children, you automatically think mother, woman, weaker at that time when it was published, right? Or because it was simply too difficult to spend time immersing and thinking about how she had felt about the things she had to do with her children during the war. I can't imagine how hard it would have been for her to write that. And you get a sense of that on a few occasions through the novel, where she lapses and talks about how she feels. And she doesn't do it very often, again, typical of a woman. But for me, as the researcher, those are the moments where you pay attention and you go, oh, okay, the fact that she has let herself dive into how she felt there is important. I need to pay attention, and I need to take out of that whatever I can. So there's one moment when in 1943, the Nazis put her two children on their most wanted list, which is obviously a really diabolical thing to do. And they're doing that in an attempt to flush Marie Madeleine out, because they know that if they capture her children, she will come for them. So Marie Madeleine knows that she's got to get her children out of France. She can't keep them safe anymore in a country where they're wanted by the Nazis. And she's in Lyon at this time. She gets an organization called the Amitié Chrétienne, who are smuggling Jewish children across the border to Switzerland to help her get her children into Switzerland. And she can't go and see her kids before they leave, because to go and see them would be like leading the Nazis right to them, potentially, signing a death warrant for her children. But one of her agents arranges for Marie Madeleine to stand in the window of an apartment building up high, looking down into this particular street the day before the children are going to cross the border. And the agent walks the two children along the street so Marie Madeleine can see them for the last time. But of course, the children don't know she's up there looking down upon them, saying goodbye to them. All they know is that they have to leave the country, and that they haven't seen their mother for months, and that she isn't there to say goodbye to them. And she's got to watch them and not call out and say, I love you, I miss you, I want to be with you. She can't say any of that, because she can't risk them looking up and revealing to the Nazis where she is and that they're her children, and then again they all get arrested. So she has to stand there, and she talks about that in her memoir, and she says that she felt like she was being buried alive in that moment. And like I say, it's a tiny fragment, but when you compare that tiny fragment to the very factual kind of the rest of the way the book is worded, like that really sticks out. And so you go, okay, she felt a lot in that moment, and I'm going to use those little bits of text that are scattered throughout to channel into those feelings that she did have for her children as their mother.
Absolutely incredible. And just the fact that she did know that she probably wouldn't see them for long stretches of time. And would they remember her? Would they feel the same way about her when they eventually did see her again and were reunited? It's just that maybe it's because I'm a mother and you're a mother, and we can tap into that feeling of truly understanding what it is like for a mother to be separated from her children. I just found those passages so heart-wrenching.
Oh, absolutely. And it was the one moment, when you're writing these kinds of books, you like to think you would have been able to, work for the resistance and fight for freedom. But writing that scene, I thought, I don't know whether I could have done that. I don't know whether I could have watched my three children walk on by, not knowing, she doesn't know in 1943 when the war is going to end. It could go for 10 more years, They'll be adults by then. I don't know that I could have just stood there. And that just goes to show how strong and extraordinary she was, because she knew she had to. To do anything else would have been to risk too many lives. And it shows the depth, in fact, of her love. Some people will say, well, she abandoned her children, but to me, it shows the exact opposite. It shows how much she loved them, that she was able to make herself stand there because keeping them alive was the most important thing.
And also about giving them a hopeful future.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, that was a big part of her reasoning for doing what she was. She understood the way Nazis viewed women, and that her daughter in particular, Beatrice, would have no opportunities in the future if the Nazis were going to remain in France.
Natasha, this book also explores the experiences of women who defy societal expectations. And Marie Madeleine is a prime example of this. As mentioned, she undertook many activities at the time that weren't really considered suitable for women, but she wasn't the only woman in the resistance movement. And there were many women in the book who joined the cause and are recruited as active agents. So was that borne out by the research you uncovered?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there's this one moment which I love in her memoir. I love that she notices this. And that's what I mean about, that I wanted to write her as a female leader, because I think she led differently because of that. So she's just gone to a house at a place called Le Lavandou, which is down on the south coast of France. It's going to be her new headquarters for a certain period of time. And she walks in, and there's a woman whose code name is B. They all had animal code names. And B has set the table, cooked all this food to feed the agents at headquarters. And, Marie Madeleine reflects on the fact that here are all these women working just as hard as the agents out in the field behind the scenes, because if you don't feed the agents, they're not going to be able to keep going out and doing what they're doing. And there's this army of women, she calls them, who are doing jobs that are equally as important, but so unrecognized. People only write stories about the people who were kind of out there in the field. They don't write about the women making the food for the people out there in the field, but you need all of those people. So she had a lot of women in her network. Not all of them were, preparing the tables and cooking the food. And in fact, B takes on a larger role later in the war. She had many women in senior positions, and she couldn't have done what she did without them, because, the women were the ones who were able to walk freely through the streets and not attract suspicion, because nobody expects much of a woman. It goes right down to the code name Marie Madeleine chose, which was the hedgehog, because it's this little creature that nobody expects anything of. The men in her network are, wolf and eagle and all these, bold, brave, heroic kind of creatures. And she's the hedgehog because it scuttles around in the undergrowth. Nobody pays it any attention. But, when it needs to, it can roll itself up into a ball and give you one hell of a spike. So I love that about her.
You spoke a little bit earlier about this one mission that Marie-Madeleine did, and that was to, cross the border into Spain in a mailbag. And it was just extraordinary, made more so extraordinary by the fact that she has a hip problem. So
Correct.
tell me about this and the fact that you seem to share a particular characteristic with Marie-Madeleine, which is extraordinary in itself.
Yes, I know. Yes, so she needed to cross the border into Spain to go and speak to the British because her headquarters had been raided and she'd lost her radios and her money. And so she needed to get more radios and more money. And one of her agents was working for the government as well as being an agent for her. And his job was couriering this diplomatic mailbag from the French embassy in Spain to the Vichy French government headquarters. And I can't even believe she thought of this, that she would cram herself into the mailbag, which was a 4 foot by 2 foot mailbag. She was 5'7", to get herself over the border because she couldn't just catch the train over the border because she couldn't get travel papers from the Nazis. No way they were going to let her, cross the border into Spain. And so she does cram herself into this bag. She thinks it's only going to be for 2 hours because the car has to go onto a train through the tunnel from France to Spain. And she's in this very awkward, sort of full squat with her torso folded down over her shins. She's got this thing called hip dysplasia, which is very painful in just a normal everyday life, let alone when you're folded over and double in a mailbag for a couple of hours. But when they get the car to the train station, they find out that it's actually going to be 10 hours because the train's left early and they've got to wait for the next train, which isn't coming for 8 hours, plus the 2 hours through the tunnel. She's got to stay folded up in this bag. She can't eat, she can't drink. Like, I don't think I physically could have survived that. She's naked as well, apart from her underwear, because they couldn't fit her dress on her in the bag. They had to take it off to fit her in the bag properly. And when she gets to the end, she does survive, but she can't walk because her hip, all of her muscles are cramped. And in particular, her hip is excruciatingly painful. And her agent has to carry her into the British Embassy in Spain because she's incapable of walking. My second daughter was born with hip dysplasia. Marie-Madeleine's daughter also had hip dysplasia because it's a congenital condition. And when my daughter was born with it, all the doctors that she saw, and she saw many, said to me, "Oh, who in your family's got it? It's congenital." And I was like, "I don't know. I've never heard of it. I've never heard of it. Didn't know anything about it. Had no idea. Just thought it was a fluke, a mystery. She just got it from who knew why she'd had it." And then in my late 40s, I was diagnosed with osteoporosis. And as part of that process, they x-ray your spine and your hips because you can carry these small fractures that you don't know about that you just kind of pass off as pain. They want to make sure that you don't have any of those. And so I went to see my endocrinologist to get the results. And she said to me, "Well, the good news is you don't have any fractures, but the bad news is your hip dysplasia is looking really bad." And I was like, "What?" And she said, "Oh, your hip dysplasia is looking really bad." And I said, "I don't have hip dysplasia." She said, "Oh, well, yes, you do. Look at your x-rays." And then she said, "You must be in pain." And I said, "Well, yeah, I just go to the physio every couple of weeks." I didn't know what it was. I just thought it was like, I don't know, normal human women pain kind of thing. And I had this pain for years. And, like Marie-Madeleine, you just get on with your life and you put up with it. And, in the same way that she tries to hide the limp that she has when her pain is quite bad, I'd done exactly the same thing for years and years. And so it was this extraordinary kind of revelation that I'd had this untreated and undiagnosed hip dysplasia since I was born. And I always say that the muse gifts you the knowledge that you need only at the time when you most need it. And at that moment, I was struggling to get her character onto the page in a way that conveyed that she was just like you and me and made her relatable to the reader. I kind of had her on this pedestal. And that knowledge that I shared this thing with her made me able to write her from within her body, because everything she felt in her body was the same thing that I felt in my body. So I could literally write her from the inside out. And suddenly, she fell onto the page in exactly the way I needed her to, just because of that bizarre set of coincidental circumstances.
I mean, I guess some people would say it was serendipity that
Yeah.
you shared this, trait with her and that you were able to identify with her in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Bit of serendipity and, good to actually know what it is so that then I can then treat it properly too. So it had a couple of upsides.
Oh, absolutely. Now, Natasha, reading the author's note at the back of the book, it's clear that you've had to make adjustments to the story for practical reasons. But it led me to think about how, as a writer, you explore this space between fact and fiction in a novel like this, because there are many actual facts that underpin this story. But I wondered if you could take us through how you decide what goes in and what stays out.
It's really just a process of trying to remember you've got a reader and you've got to maintain the reader's interest, and that I will be interested in all the obscure facts, but not everybody's brain works like mine. And so you've got 3,000 agents. They all have real names and code names. You've got 6,000 names to grapple with, and you can't put that many names into a book. Nobody is going to read it. So it's a matter of working out who are the most important people, what were the most important events, which people were connected to those important events, kind of listing them all out, and then trying to figure out of that a short list. And then you've got to whittle down your short list because it's still too many people. And in the end, you have to combine people into a kind of a composite character, just simply for readability. And the same thing with the number of headquarters in the book. They moved, 60 or 70 times. It's too many different French locations for people who are unfamiliar with that geography to carry in their heads as they're reading. So you have to keep them in one place for longer than they would have been in reality. So it's always about remembering that you have a reader. And my mission in life is to make sure everybody knows about Marie Madeleine and, kind of honors her. And so to make that mission successful, I've got to make the book readable. And so all of those decisions are made in the light of readability and, recognizing that people get written out of the page of the history books like Marie Madeleine has, and that I don't want to do that, but I have to. Otherwise, it's just going to be too long and nobody is going to read it.
As the leader of the largest spy network in France during World War II, Marie Madeleine suffered extreme doubt about her ability to lead, which is something you mentioned before, and especially when dealing with organizations like MI6, key contacts, and other agents. And for a long time, she was concerned to keep her sex and identity hidden, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was. Because we're talking the 1940s, it's a very patriarchal society. MI6 is a patriarchal organization. Before the war, no women worked for them. They had some female agents during the war, but Marie Madeleine didn't know that, of course. Yeah. That kind of thing isn't being communicated back and forth. So she worried that if MI6 found out that a woman had taken over the leadership, they would stop supporting it. So she hid her identity simply because she knew how important it was for the network to keep going. Luckily, as it turns out, her MI6 liaison was a very open-minded man, and he knew that the Allies just needed as much information as they could get. Alliance was providing that, so he didn't care if she was a woman, a man, or a hedgehog. He was going to let her keep doing what she was doing so successfully.
But I guess, tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, it was the fact that she was a woman and a mother, perhaps, that she was such an extraordinary, that made her such an extraordinary leader and inspired such loyalty from her agents.
I agree. I think so. She really took the time to know her agents as people, and she took the time to know her agents' families. She knew their children's names, she knew their mothers and their grandmothers, and she would send them gifts. And she really deeply cared for them. She wasn't the leader up on high with all these subordinates who kind of had to get through layers of hierarchy to get to her. She was right there in the radio room next to these 18, 19-year-old boys who are running the radio transmissions to MI6. She talks about how much she loved being there with these, ebullient young boys who were so full of life. And she had so much fun kind of working alongside them. So she was a very collegiate kind of leader. And I mean, it's hard to say that that's the difference in a man's style or a woman's style. Maybe it was just particular to her, but I think it is highly unusual that she did take the time to get to know her agents and their families so deeply, and that she continued after the war to keep her agents and their families together. She had kind of yearly picnics where they would all get together. She continued to raise money for the families of her agents that had died. That family continued for the rest of Marie Madeleine's life.
Oh, that is truly extraordinary. And I guess I also thought that it was this loyalty and commitment to her and the cause that saw many of the agents die terrible deaths at the hands of the Nazis. It's a huge burden for one person to bear.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know how you walk away from something like that without a part of your soul being permanently damaged. And of course, she doesn't reflect on that in her memoir. She's not going to kind of go there. I don't know whether she couldn't or she just wouldn't because, she's a woman writing a wartime memoir, but that just the fact that she kept, having these picnics and kept working with her agents after the war tells me that the burden of responsibility that she felt never left her.
So tell me more about Leon Fay. He was her second in command in the network, and you were able to look at a diary he kept while he was in prison in Germany.
Yes, that's right. So that's kept at the archives in France. He kind of left that diary hidden behind a radiator in one of the prisons he was kept in, and it makes for quite distressing reading, reading about the daily experiences of a German prisoner of war and the way he was treated. And, I always worry these days how a historical novelist is going to write anything about people now in 50 years' time, because we don't keep any of these kinds of records. It's fantastic that people did, because I wouldn't have been able to write him as a main point of view character without getting that sense of his voice, the way he spoke, his kind of concerns, the kinds of things he thought about, and it was just really crucial to me in writing those scenes.
You mentioned that he was a main point of view character. And so I guess it made me think about the structure of this book, most of which is written, as I said before, from Marie-Madeleine's point of view in the first person, which I found incredibly effective. We have a present and a past timeline. And then we have some chapters from Leon's point of view, which made me incredibly emotional. Could you tell me about your decision to structure the novel this way?
I wanted to show not just what life was like for Marie-Madeleine and her agents within France. I wanted people to also get a sense of what life was like for someone who was captured by the Nazis, because I think that's a really important part, because it happened to so many of her agents, that to leave that out of the book meant it was missing a layer that was needed in the book. So that was the main reason why I wanted to show that. And also, he's such a heroic character too. Most people don't know his name. I think that's an extraordinary shame, because of what he did and how hard he fought for freedom. I was a bit awestruck by him as well, in the same way that I was by Marie-Madeleine. And as soon as I got him onto the page, I was like, no, he needs to have this storyline which shows people the length of time that someone could remain in prison during World War II, and what kind of person is able to get through that length of time with all their faculties intact, because that's actually very challenging.
Whenever I read a book like this, Natasha, a book that plucks historical figures out of obscurity and shows us what bravery in the face of pure evil looks like, it makes me kind of stop and consider humanity as a whole, how we as humans can inflict such cruelty on one another, and how we seem not to be able to learn from our past mistakes. And you've written so many books now that deal with war and the human suffering that results. I wondered, do you ever lose your faith in humanity in the process?
No, because of people like Leon Fay and Marie-Madeleine. Those are two examples of the kind of people who are the most incredible human beings. And that's, just a couple, but there were so many more like that. I think you find more heroes in the pages of history when you go looking for them than you do find evil, cruel people. So, no, I've never lost my faith in humanity. In fact, it's only bolstered it.
And so if there was one thing that you'd like readers to take away from this novel, Natasha, what would that be?
It would be the fact that we can all do so much if we choose to, particularly in the world right now. I think that's a really powerful message to consider and to remember. We can choose to do nothing and to sit back, or we can choose to throw ourselves wholeheartedly into it, or we can do something in between. But we have the choice. We aren't disempowered people who aren't able to influence the outcome of our lives. We all can do that.
Now, I want to go back to the French photographer for a moment, if I may. And if there are any listeners out there who might have seen a recent film starring Kate Winslet called Lee, she plays the role of Lee Miller, the woman who inspired the novel that you wrote. And I wondered, did you see it and what were your thoughts on it?
I did. I saw it twice, in fact. I loved it. Cried like a baby both times, even more the second time, despite knowing what would happen. Kate Winslet is extraordinary, and I was extremely disappointed that she wasn't at least nominated for an Academy Award for her performance. I think she was robbed. If you haven't seen the movie, listeners, go and see it. One of the best films that I saw last year.
I agree with you. It was incredibly powerful and very moving.
Yeah.
Now, Natasha, from the days when I first discovered your work with A Kiss from Mr. Fitzgerald, your writing and your career have gone from strength to strength. You have an international career and a very loyal fan base who gobble up pretty much anything that you write. And I know that it's taken many years of hard work on your part to get to this point, but in view of those incredible successes, I wondered if you had any pearls of wisdom to offer writers out there about writing in general or getting published.
The main thing is just don't give up. When I teach writing classes, I always quote from another writer, Danny Shapiro, who talks about standing in the front of a classroom and there'll be many very gifted writers in the room, but it isn't always necessarily the most gifted writers who are the ones who are still getting published 10 years later. It's the ones who endure, the ones who get through the rejections and keep writing, the ones who understand that the writing life is one of highs and lows and you've got to ride them all out because you just never know when the luck is around the corner. So if you love writing, then keep writing because that's the best way to be a writer. Endure, be the one who endures.
Is there another project on the horizon for you?
Yes, I'm actually this week have just started working on the structural edits for my next book, which is coming out next year. It's called The Chateau on Sunset. So it's going to be fun.
And I mean, I don't know anything about it yet, but is it another World War II novel?
No, I don't think I could ever write another World War II novel again after the Mademoiselle Alliance. I think that is my crowning achievement in terms of a World War II novel. There is no woman from that time more extraordinary than Marie Madeleine. So it will be different time periods from now on.
Wonderful. That takes care of my next question. Natasha, it's been an honor and a complete joy to talk to you about this incredible and unforgettable story. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, it was my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.